Can you believe that Easter was just 3 weeks ago? It seems a long time ago. And on Easter, we asked ourselves the question, what story are we telling? Today, we have the story from that same day, and it's in the evening. And today, I want to ask us the question, what voices are you listening to? You know, we're a congregational church, and we listen to all the voices in this community. We seek collective wisdom to discern God's purpose and will. We value the collective spirit. We value what each person brings and has to say. But today I want to talk about the voices in our mind, the committee in our head. Anybody got one of those committees in their head? They argue amongst themselves, trying to reach a decision. We got the CEO, we got the perfectionist, we got the gatekeeper. And depending on what's going on in our lives, we listen to, or at least give one voice more weight than another, more prominence than another. On that first Easter evening, there were a lot of voices going on in that room behind the locked doors. Just imagine it for a moment. Voice of fear, of dismay, grief, despair, exhaustion, disbelief. The voice of, how did we get here? But then Jesus arrives, uninvited, didn't even knock. And they hear a different voice, the voice of peace, the voice of forgiveness, the voice of spirit. And he leaves, and then Thomas comes in. And most of us have heard of Thomas. He's been cast all this millennia as doubting Thomas. He's cast as a character, the voice of doubt. But maybe he's just the voice of evidence, the voice of hard facts, the voice of data. In that locked room, huddled together, were representatives of many of the voices in our head. And what voice they ultimately listened to shaped the future in a profound way. Think about it for a moment. If they had listened to the voice of despair, we would not be here together today. So much was at stake, and they had every reason to be discouraged, to give up, because the world as they knew it in that moment, all their dreams, their hopes, their aspirations had come to an end. And no less is true today. The world as we have known it is coming to an end. And what voice will we listen to? Because so much is at stake. So somebody say, I think I'm with you, but keep going. Oh, thank you. Okay, well, so you heard from multiple news sources this week that a new study has come out that 1 million plant and animal species are on the verge of extinction, with alarming implications for human survival. This is happening at a more rapid rate than this has ever occurred in the history of the world. One thing that struck me so deeply this week was to see the photos of the whales that have washed up in Ocean Beach in San Francisco at Tiburon. 9 whales in 2 months. Some hit by ships, some malnourished, and some they can't figure out what has happened. Whales. Remember back in, so much time has passed in my life, I can't remember what decade it was, but 60s, 70s, the Save the Whales. Well, I don't know about you, but in the circles I was in at that time, people laughed at that. They thought that was just funny, save the whales. And here we are. Maybe if we had paid more attention back then. It would be easy to listen to the voice of despair just hearing the news about this. The voice of resignation, the voice of, I can't do anything. Years ago, I was at a Zen retreat. They would do these exercises as they talked about the voices in our head. We do this exercise that would say, please allow me to speak to the voice of, they would speak to that voice in you. So let me speak to the voice that may be in your head of despair. We speak to the voice of despair and say, despair, how will you serve the world in any way that is good? Let me speak to the voice of fear. Fear, how are you helping us to be whole? The voice of fear is primal, isn't it? And it's fueling our national conversations. Now, we need to face fears. We need to name them for sure. But when we give that voice preeminence, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who is originally from East Germany, says, fear has never been a good advisor. We know that fear locks doors and builds walls and protects only its own and activates in all of us that reptilian part of our brain. But what if I said, rather than please allow me to speak to the voice of fear, what if I said to each of you, please allow me to speak to the voice of hope? Hope, where do you live? Where does hope live in your body? Hope, where have you triumphed in the past? You know, hope is not optimism. It's not Pollyannish. It's not an attitude even. Hope is active. Hope faces reality head on. But hope ignites the moral imagination to change that reality. Hope is an act of defiance. It says this is not the end of the story. And hope shines brightest when the odds are the worst. That's hope's job. Hope says, I can make a difference. I will make a difference. In the book Climate Church, Climate World by Jim Antal, who happens to be a UCC minister in Massachusetts and the conference minister there, he travels all over the country talking about this. He said, hope is the most important contribution people of faith can and must make as humanity confronts the climate crisis. It's our job to be bearers of hope. Margaret Atwood, the feminist novelist, Canadian, who wrote, if you haven't read her, The Handmaid's Tale. I heard her interviewed, and she said, it's not climate change, it's everything change. And she said this, which just kind of threw me for a moment. She said, unless people with faith get behind fixing the planet, I thought this was Margaret Atwood. Unless people of faith get behind fixing the planet, it is not going to happen. Why? Because faith is motivating. And then she says, you don't save what you don't love. So people of faith, reject that old dominion over the earth theory that you might have been taught as Christians. Love the earth. So please allow me to speak to the voice of hope. Hope. What role will you play? How will you breathe imagination into a life of a people? How will you help us learn to live differently? How will you ignite us with the unrelenting belief in the power of spirit and of the triumph of human spirit? Hope gives imagination. I read a story this week about two gangs, I believe in Chicago, and they were fighting, and the police came to break up the fight. And then a policewoman kind of walked into the midst and said, okay, you just kind of disperse everybody. And a defiant teenager came up to her and started playing the song, you might now know it, Watch Me, it's called, do you know it? Now watch me whip, now watch me nay-nay, now watch me whip, now watch me nay-nay. Surely you've heard, well, maybe you don't have a teenager in your house. Okay. And started dancing, and the cop said, that's all you got? I got better dance moves than that. So the cop started dancing. And for 2 minutes, they did a dance-off. And at the end, they're like, let's call it a tie. It changed the entire atmosphere. Imagination. I'm not pointing my gun at you or pulling out my taser or my billy club. I'm going to dance this out of you. Hope speaks in the best exotic marigold hotel. Everything will be all right in the end. And if it's not all right, it's not the end. It goes on, because the only failure is a failure to try. That's the only failure, the failure to try. I was strangely touched. Even the voice of despair was speaking to me this week. For yet another shooting at a school. You know, they've got this whole mantra now. Have you read about this? Trying to teach the kids. There's a school shooting. Run, hide, fight. Have you seen that mantra? It's tragic that our kids have to learn a mantra like that. I heard this 12-year-old boy, Nate Hawley, in Colorado, interviewed. He was at that school. He said, yeah, I hid in a corner and I had my hand on the door, but he said I also had a metal baseball bat in my hand. Because if I was going to go down, I was going to go down fighting. That's the voice of hope, courage speaking through that kid. The voice of hope. We must give that voice preeminence. When it comes to climate change, when it comes to gun violence, when it comes to the other issues that are stripping away our humanity and threatening so many lives on our planet. The voice of hope speaks through Denise Levertov, as she says, the poet. We have only begun to love the earth. We have only begun to imagine the fullness of life. How could we tire of hope? So much is in bud. How can desire fail? We have only begun to love and imagine justice and mercy, only begun to envision how it might be to live with siblings, with beast and flower, not as oppressors. Surely, our river cannot already be hastening into the sea of non-being. Surely, it cannot drag in the silt all that is innocent. Not yet. Not yet. Too much is broken that has to be mended. Too much hurt we have done to one another that is yet to be forgiven. We have only begun to know the power that is in us if we would join our solitudes in the communion of struggle. So much is unfolding. So much is unfolding that must complete its gesture. So much is in bud. Let the voice of hope rise in us, calling us to action, calling us to believe that every small act and big act makes a difference. Amen.